Right, here we go. The last Sherlock Holmes story. Chapter 3, Part 5. And this one has got about 9.5 pages left to read on this chapter. So here we go. The face was familiar, and yet quite strange. Had I not been half expecting to see my friend, I doubt I would have known him. He was a master of disguise, of course, but this one was like of all great inspirations was simplicity itself. It had darkened his complexion slightly, and he had a refined moustache curled at the tip. The effect was to give of his face distinctly Semitic appearance. This was accentuated by his dress, which might best be described as elegantly sumptuous. He wore a dark felt hat and a long fur-trimmed coat, beneath which I caught sight of a white collar and black tie, retained with his from his original costume. He had a pair of kid gloves in one hand and a small package in the other, and carried himself in such a way as to appear a good 6 inches shorter than his full height. The general impression was a prosperous man of commerce, something in the city whose taste still smacked of the bazaars and counting houses from which his forefathers had come. It was truly a masterful impersonation, for he had not tried to impose alien features on his own by dint of trickery. Rather, with a few deft touches, he had exposed an alien Holmes, one I had never seen before, but who had now seemed to have been there all the while in that face. I'd come to think as so characteristically and essentially British. The instant of recognition was succeeded by an acute sensation of doubt to my own position. My natural impulses was to run after Holmes, confess my wrong-headedness, and throw myself on his mercy. I quickly thought better of this. However, these were deep waters, and it was by no means certain that Holmes would have welcomed my presence in them. On the other hand, I could hardly go off and abandon him. What if the message I was to have given Lestrade formed a vital element in his calculations? He had spoken of these unpatrolled streets as the open door of the trap. Had my message been the signal so to close that door, I began to appreciate how horribly short-sighted my insubordination had been. Had Holmes not praised me for my soldiery dependency on my readiness to follow orders without question, what a hideous irony it would be if my failure in that respect provided his undoing. But it was too late by now for second thoughts. All I could do was follow my friend discreetly, and stand ready to lend such aid as I could if the need arose. Holmes was very evidently in no hurry now, but I was able to keep in pace with him quite easily. Before he had gone very far, however, it occurred to me that my very presence, even at a distance, might constitute a danger. Our association was well known to Moriarty, as was my appearance. Holmes had disguised himself to perfection. But what about me? I decided to disguise him. Sorry. But what about me? I decided to attempt a little elementary camouflage. I pulled off my coat, turned it inside out, and put it on again. I then removed my necktie, placed it in my hat, and threw both over a wall. This was good, however, but it needed some finishing touch. I walked nearer to the curb and pretended to skip, precepting myself into the gutter. I rolled from side to side, disturbing the mud about my person, before rising unsteadily to complete the picture. I rubbed a handful of dirt down my face. The cold night resounded with peals of laughter from the trio of inebriants. I ignored them and resumed my progress with some pride in my ability to emulate Holmes' methods. No one now, I thought, would stop to question that I had merely started to celebrate the Lord Mayor's ascension a little early. The rain, which came and went all night, had largely emptied the streets. The bleak buildings rose up on either side, as sheer forbidding as cliffs basalt. We might have been lost in some monstrous abyss, through which the wind gusted and howled with primal force of a mountain torrent. The the guttering lamp provided just enough illumination to make the desolation of the scene fully apparent. On and on we walked through the streets we had patrolled side by side. Holmes kept moving steadily ahead, never pausing in his stride, never looking back. I kept to the opposite pavement and hung back at every corner, but clearly my friend had no inkling that he was being followed. We seemed to have been walking for an hour or more when we encountered the man and girl. My wound was by this time giving me considerable pain, and it was only with difficulty that I was able to maintain Holmes' pace, moderate though this was. I was in fact wondering how much longer I would be able to keep up the relentless march, when all at once the situation changed dramatically. The first thing I noticed was that Holmes had stopped in a street corner. At a moment later, a man passed by the cross street. He was somewhat stout and was shabbily dressed, with a wide awake hat. I did not remark him particularly, for we had passed and had been passed by many persons in the course of our promenade. Holmes stopped at the corner for a minute or two, and then turned to the right and disappeared. I hastened to reach the corner, and there beheld a strange scene. Walking towards Holmes was a young woman dressed in a dark skirt and a shawl. She was evidently a prostitute, although rather younger and more attractive than most specimens of the class we had encountered. She seemed a little worse for drink, and her gait was unsteadily. As she came up to Holmes, I was astonished to see my friend place his hand upon her shoulder in familiar fashion. He then made some remark at which they both laughed. All this was indeed a cause for wonder, but my attention was drawn elsewhere. For a little further along the street I spied the man who had passed by a minute early. This disreputable-looking individual had stationed himself under the lamp of a public house, from which vantage point he was keeping surreptitious eye on my friend. And the young woman, suddenly the affair began to assume a distinctly sinister... Sorry, I'll start that again. The disreputable-looking individual had stationed himself under the lamp of a public house, from which vantage point he was keeping a surreptitious eye on my friend, and the young woman, on the young woman, keeping a surreptitious eye on my friend and the young woman. Suddenly, the affair began to assume a distinctly sinister aspect. Was it indeed by sheer coincidence that the man and the girl had happened to pass one another at this spot? Why had this man remained? Why was he showing such a marked interest in a distinct district where indifference was cardinal virtue in matters none of his business? In matters that were none of his business. Even as these thoughts were running through my head, Holmes and the young woman moved off together. As they passed by the watcher under the lamp, I saw him look closely at Holmes, as if to make sure of this man. Then, as the couple turned the corner, he left the post to follow them. I now had no further doubts. The man and the girl were clearly accomplices of Moriarty. Her task must be to lure Holmes at a suitably secluded spot where the man could strike him down. What a hideous accomplishment if this fell plan were to succeed! How Moriarty would gloat! What a brilliant exclamation mark to set his glory monogram! But the game was not yet lost. The Professor's henchman had not yet observed my presence in the shadows. While he stalked Holmes, I in turn marked him down. I was armed and ready, and my intervention would be all the more effective for being unexpected. Thus, in solemn procession, we passed through the gloomy corridors of Whitechapel. In the van was Holmes with a young woman, unaware that 20 yards back the stout man was skulking along the trail, while the latter was in turn blissfully ignorant that bringing up the rear was one whose head was clear, despite appearances on the contrary, and whose untrembling fingers grasped the trigger of a loaded revolver. In this fashion we returned to the same squalid street from which I had followed Holmes in the first place. He and the girl came to rest at the archway between the two houses. The stout man also stopped. On the other side of the street I stepped into a gateway from which I was able to command an excellent view of the proceedings. To anyone acquainted with the character of Sherlock Holmes, these were quite startling. The woman stood up against the arch addressing him in the vulgar, piercing tone of her ilk. It was my friend's response which astonished me. His words were inaudible, but I plainly saw him lean forward and kiss the woman's face. They continued to converse together with a minute or two before going in under the arch together. Once the stout man shook off his lethargy and marched boldly up to the archway. He looked into the passage, and there too he vanished from sight. Here then was the crisis. The girl had somehow induced Holmes to enter a dark alley, where the stout man was now about to assault him, no doubt striking the first blow, while my friend's back was turned. There was not a moment to lose. I made for the archway with all the speed I could muster, given the state of my throbbing Achilles tendon. But in the event, it was as well as I was not swifter, for as I was on the point of entering the passage, I caught the sound of someone coming out. No sooner had I flattened myself in the doorway of the adjoining house that the stout man reappeared. He looked briefly up and down the street, and then proceeded to cross over to the lodging house opposite, beneath whose lamp he had took up the position as before. I now had to revise my ideas. Evidently, the ruffian was not himself going to attempt Holmes's life. His job was merely to keep watch, pending the arrival of some third party. It was no extraordinary feat of deduction to conclude that this would prove to be none other than Moriarty himself. The Professor was coming to settle accounts in person with his arch enemy. Of course, it was absurd to think that at this supreme climax to the most odious series of killings in history, Moriarty would permit another to privilege him, The Professor was coming to settle accounts in person with his arch enemy. Of course, it was absurd to think that at the supreme climax to the most odious series of killings in history, Moriarty would permit another the privilege of striking the fatal blow. He would come himself. He must come. This being the case, it only remained for me. He must come. This being the case, it only remained for me to gain entrance to the passage and warn Holmes of the danger in which he stood, and we might yet turn the tables of this inhuman genius. But how was I to get by the watchdog for a moment? I thought of simply drawing my revolver and taking the man in charge, but it soon occurred to me that it would not do for Moriarty to see that his Servius was missing. This would alert his suspicions, and he might make good his escape. How was I to manage it? I turned the question over in my mind without arriving at any conclusion. In the end, chance smoothed the way for me, A man came down on the street and turned into the lodging house. As he did, he caught sight of the stout man with whom he was evidently acquainted. The two fell into conversation, in the course of which my adversary turned away, allowing me to slip from cover and enter the narrow, vaulted passage. Once inside, the darkness wrapped me in a cloak of invisibility. This alley led into a small, unlit courtyard, consisting of 2 rows of mean cottages facing each other across a gutter. I was wondering which of these dwellings might contain Holmes and the girl, when I was greatly startled to hear my friend's voice seemingly at my elbow. I noticed for the first time a door set in the wall to my right. Again I heard Holmes speak, although I could not make out of the sense. I moved stealthily around the corner of the house and soon discovered that it was possible to see through the clink of the curtains covering one of the 2 windows. I peered in. The room was very small, cramped, although it contained only the barest of modicum of furniture. A candle on the table before the window provided the only light. A mass of wood and coal was piled unlit in the grate. Some clothes skated at the floor of the bed, which was the female sprawled, tilting a spirit flask on her lips. "Don't down it like a blue ruin, woman." The voice was Holmes. He was seated in the only chair in the room, his back to the window. The girl stared at him for a moment. Her head swayed in befuddled puzzlement. "You want some?" she asked finally. Holmes had taken his snuff box from his pocket and was shaking the powder onto the back of his wrist. I was surprised at this, for I had never known him to take snuff. He drew the powder up to his nostrils and then shook his head and laughed. "No, I have rarer pleasures. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to brazier life. I meant only to point out that what you are drinking is fine cognac, not a max at 3 halfpenny a measure." The woman shrugged and tossed the flask down on the bed covers. "It all goes the same way home, don't it?" said she with a giggle. Just then I heard footsteps in the passage. My heart raced. Was Moriarty already upon us? I waited tentatively, my head back to the wall. Then the figure passed by, and I saw it was only an old woman. She disappeared into one of the cottages further down the yard. A false alert, but it had served to remind me how exposed my position was at the window. Anyone leaving the courtyard could not fail to see me there, and the resulting alarm might well ruin everything. Either I had to enter the room and warn Holmes, or conceal myself somewhere in the yard and await developments. After a moment's consideration, I chose the second course. I found a spot for my bivouac at the end of the yard. From there I had a clear view of the only door in the room, which Holmes was waiting. The light rain had returned, but to an old campaigner, the hardships of the post was slight and easily endured. I settled down with my back to the wall and my coat wrapped around me, basking in the inner satisfaction of knowing that for the first time since disobeying Holmes' original order, I was once again in control of events. My friend was in no present danger, and I was well placed to challenge my future threat. I felt deeply relieved at having brought the affair to this happy stage. I was deceived, of course, but it is not of that I am now ashamed. My errors were honest, and the truth and inconceivable abomination. Now, what I blush to confess is my unforgivable weakness in falling asleep on my watch. For this there can be no excuse. If my conjectures had been correct, it would have been a monstrous dereliction of duty. And who shall say what might have happened had I been awake to hear the voice that cried murder? But enough. The facts are that After lying huddled in the corner of that yard for over an hour, my body aching and my brain exhausted, I simply dozed off. I awoke, chilled to the bone from what I thought at first to only have been a brief nap. I was aghast to discover, and on consulting my watch, that it was almost 5 o'clock. For a moment I lay incredulous on the cobbles where I had slumbered. For I closed on 2 hours. There was a thrill of mortal terror. I remembered there I was. Holmes' words suddenly echoed through my skull. He must kill twice on the same spot. Two victims, Holmes and the young woman. What could be simpler or more effective? It would be more typically economical an elegant solution to the pretty problem. My friend had mentioned Moriarty would at once put an end to his duel with Holmes and dispose of the witness who might otherwise embarrass him in the future, was still fulfilling the requirements of this diabolical design. I struggled to my feet and moved silently and swiftly up the courtyard to the window, though which I had earlier spied on the roof. To my chagrin, I found the curtains were now tightly drawn, and I was stunned to hear someone moving inside the room. I struggled to control my excitement as I realised that though I might be too late to save my friend, I could still avenge him. As I edged cautiously around the corner towards the door, I noticed that one of the panes of the other window had been broken, and then suddenly stopped up with a piece of cloth. Here was a capital opportunity to reconate before launching my attack. With infinite care, I worked the waddling loose. Then I inserted my hand and patted the curtains. I was prepared for horrors, but for the first sight that met my eyes. I was prepared for horrors, but for the first sight that met my eyes, there could be no preparation. At first glance, it suggested some appalling natural disaster. Was it possible, I wondered, for a person to explode? Then with sickening certainty, I recognised that the mess of strewn flesh as the woman I had seen drinking and talking with her Sherlock Holmes. A few hours before, he was still with her, but not dead. No much worse than dead. He was alive, stripped of his undergarments. He seemed a gaunt in that tiny room. The fire was blazing, and his shadow moved hugely over the bed and its monstrous cargo. His clothes had been neatly folded and piled in the chair, safe, with the gore that covered his hands and wrists and arms, and spattered over his linen. As he moved, so did his shadow. And then one saw more of the girl. She lay on her back, and the blood-drenched bed. Her torso was completely flayed and gutted. The bed table was covered with her organs. Her arm had been sliced through at the shoulder. Her hand shoved in deep into the shambles of her abdomen. Her gaping throat was a horror to behold, but the worst by far was her face. The nose had been ripped away, together with the ears, and the skin was cut to ribbons. With a devilish discretion, he had saved her eyes, undisturbed, that stared at me from out of the wreckage of her face, a look as impossible to avoid as was to meet. As for Holmes, he had his clay pipe and his pathologist's knife, and just then he was working on the right thigh, stripping back the flesh to expose the femur. After a while, he laid down the knife and lifted a piece of meat and arranged it carefully to hang from the picture rail. He hummed a sprightly melody as he worked. I could not place at the time, but having heard the piece since in rather different circumstances, I'm able to reveal that it may be worth that it is known as La Doma Immobile. That it is known as La Dama Immobile. And that was part 4 of The Last Sherlock Holmes. That was part 4 of part 5, I think, Oh, I'm not sure anymore. But anyway, chapter 4 is next week, and I've only got 2 more weeks. But I will continue this when I come back from my summer break. So, chapter 4, part 1 is next week. I'll check to see how many we got. Oh, quite a few pages actually, 35 pages. So, actually, maybe it won't be next week. Maybe I'll continue reading this when I come back from my summer holiday. It'd be pointless to begin doing. It'd be pointless really to begin doing chapter 4, part 1, if I can't do them, finish it off, because it's about 36 pages. There'll be no Sherlock Holmes video next week. I'll continue that when I come back from my break. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope I haven't left you too aghast by it all. And I shall see you next week with just one video. And see you next week.